Okay, welcome to the Bible study. In 6 sessions, we're going to cover the overall story of the Bible, salvation history. It's going to be a very fast-paced course. We're going to cover a lot of ground every night. And tonight, we're going to start at the beginning and cover the most foundational part of the Bible that there is, the early parts of the book of Genesis. One of the most profound things that I've ever heard since I came to faith about 12 years ago was from Father John Ricardo when he said that if you understand the first 3 chapters of Genesis correctly, then you can make sense of the rest of the whole Bible. But if you don't get the first 3 chapters correct, you'll struggle trying to make sense of everything, and things won't fit together right. So we're going to spend a lot of time making sure that that's correct. I took what he said to heart, and I really paid attention as I started studying. And what I found that these first 3 chapters aren't just critical for understanding the Bible. It's critical for understanding God. It's critical for understanding humanity and our interrelationships with each other and our interrelationships with God. It's important to understand concepts like trust and free will, conflict, sin, temptation, all sorts of different things. And it explains why having a hunger for genuine truth isn't just an option in our lives. If we want to live a good life, we would need to have a genuine hunger for genuine truth. And we need to find that through the Word. Ultimately, it allows us to properly understand what it means to be saved by Jesus Christ. But we won't talk about that tonight because that comes up in a few weeks. We're not getting into the New Testament tonight, so we'll save that. But you'll see as we go through our 6 sessions together that the concepts that we talk about tonight will keep coming back over and over and over again throughout the story of salvation history, because these chapters form the foundation of what God wants to teach us. So it's as if the whole rest of the Bible rests on these first few chapters. I've spent a lot of time studying the Bible over the last several years, but learning how the entire story fits together has been the most powerful thing to understand all of it together. Because whenever we want to learn anything from any individual part of the Bible, we need to know how it fits into the whole picture of the Bible. And if we don't know that, then we can be misunderstood when we look at the small parts. So it helps keep everything together. So before we dive into the content of the Bible, let's just take a couple of minutes and understand how the Bible is organized and how it's structured. The Bible isn't a book. Even though it's bound as one book, it's 73 books written by different authors over the course of centuries, but written by one divine author. That's why it makes sense. There's 2 main sections of the Bible. There's the Old Testament and there's the New Testament. And there's a dividing line between those, and that dividing line is Christ. Everything that's written in the Old Testament was written before Christ, and everything that's written in the New Testament is written after Christ. Really simple division, okay? Except that there's something that's slightly misleading what's on the screen right now, because the Old Testament is actually much larger than the New Testament. So, and it's actually even more than that. It's just the word testament couldn't get squeezed any further. So, but the Old Testament was written over a long period of time, so it's got more stuff in it. It's tempting, by the way, and I was tempted when I first started studying the Bible, especially in its totality. It's tempting to just focus on the New Testament, because that's where Jesus is, right? That's where everything's happy. You know, you read some of the stuff in the Old Testament, God sounds mad, and you don't want to read that part. You just want to read where everything's happy. Jesus did overturn the tables in the temple, and but it's nice to be over there. But Jesus himself explicitly teaches us that if we want to understand the New Testament properly, we need to know the Old Testament. He teaches us this explicitly. So it is important to know the whole Bible. We can't just focus on that. So, quick walkthrough of the structure of the Bible. First, there's the Old Testament. The Old Testament was developed very gradually over the course of centuries, literally over 1,000 years, by a whole bunch of different people, but again, one divine author. The Old Testament is a collection of historical books, wisdom books, and prophetic books. Historical books are the history of what was happening at that time, right? Historical book. The wisdom books are things like Proverbs and Psalms. It gives us an insight into the spirituality of the people at that particular time. And then the prophetic books are the ones that are written by the prophets. Now, some people think that prophets are people that can foretell the future. That's not what a prophet is. A prophet is someone who speaks for God, and they announce the transgressions of the people to try and get people back towards God. They announce transgressions to the king at times, which is a little dangerous, but they do it. But then if the people or the king are sort of down, they'll build them back up and announce the coming salvation. So one of the best lines I've heard about prophets is, prophets challenge the comfortable and comfort the challenged. Sort of what does the people need? What does the prophet need to say on behalf of God to the people at that time? Does he need to bring them closer to God, or does he need to challenge it? Everything will be okay. Anyway, so that's that. There's also in the Old Testament a theme that runs through it, which is the theme of covenants. We're not going to be talking about covenants tonight because there's too much to cover tonight, but we will be talking about covenants starting next week. So if you're looking forward to covenants, it starts next week. But there are covenants tonight, but we're just going to gloss over them because we need to get through a bunch of stuff. In the New Testament, there's basically four main sections or four main genres in there, like historical books, wisdom, prophetic books. There's four main genres. First are the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these tell the life and ministry of Jesus and his passion and resurrection, etc. So that's those. The Acts of the Apostles, the next section, is just one book. And this is what it says, the Acts of the Apostles. This is the life of the early church, the history of the early church, literally starting from the moment after Jesus ascends. Literally the second after here's the history of the early church. Acts of the Apostles is fantastic. It's a historical narrative of what happened in the early church. The epistles, or the common word is letters, but epistles are fancy, so we'll say that. These are the instructions to the early church. When Paul and others, but we'll talk about Paul for a second. Paul goes and sets up a church somewhere, and then once he's got it set up and says, okay, now Harlan, you're in charge, and he goes off somewhere else, and then somebody gets to Paul in the next city and says, hey, Harlan needs some help or whatever. Something's going on. He needs a little help. And Paul will write a letter back to this church instructing the early church how to live appropriately. Sometimes it's chastisement. Sometimes it's uplifting. It sort of depends on what's needed. But these are instructions to the early church. And as such, because there's nothing new under the sun, because they're instructions to the early church, they're very valuable to us now. Because there's nothing new under the sun. What they were challenged with back then is the same things we were challenged with now. So those instructions of the early church that are in there are fantastic. And then there's one last little section, which is the book of Revelation, which we will not be covering in this series because it's out there. You really, really, really need to know the whole Bible very well before you can make sense of Revelation. Because the full title is The Revelation of Jesus Christ to the Apostle John. Jesus takes John up into heaven. He sees sort of the final victory of good over evil, and then he brings him back and says, now write about it. Tell the people about it. And John struggles to do that because he's just seen something that's sort of indescribable. He comes back, and in the book of Revelation, this is why you need to know the Bible so well before you tackle Revelation. In the book of Revelation, it refers back to the rest of the Bible something like 500 different times. So if you don't know the Bible very well, you won't make sense of it. It'll just seem very strange. So you really need to know it well. For that reason, we will not be covering it, but we'll get right up to Revelation. Then you can tackle it on your own. It's fine. Anyway, so that's that. Now, there is something called the Bible timeline, and I'm a visual guy, and so I'm so happy that Jeff Cavins had the brilliant idea of putting this together sort of visually, because it's very helpful to me to see the narrative arc, the story of salvation in this chart. And we're going to go through it here in a sec. By the way, we're going to go through it up here, but after I finish, if I don't remember to tell you later, I'll tell you now. I've got this chart taped to the wall back there and taped to the wall back there. So if this interests you and go, I want to look at this in a little bit more detail because Greg walked through it real fast, you can spend as much time as you want looking at that, as you want. Anyway, so this is the Bible timeline. This is the walkthrough of what's there. The whole Bible narrative arc is like a structure or a scaffold to be able to hang new information. When you hear a new mass reading, it's like, oh, now I know where that fits. It's like, it fits here. This is what was going on. Now it makes more sense, You don't just lose it on the way out to the parking lot. You can actually hold on to it because it fits within a scaffold that's in your brain. So it's really good to know this whole thing. So we're going to start over here with the first section. And this green section, the early world, that's what we're going to be covering tonight. And this is the story of creation, the story of creation of Adam and Eve, and then chapter 3, the fall, when somebody eats an apple and everybody gets upset. Then we go on to the story of Cain and Abel, and the flood, and then the Tower of Babel. We'll be covering all of that tonight. The next section are the patriarchs. And the patriarchs are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Jacob's sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. And that makes up what we'll be talking about next week. Then the next section is here, and we see Egypt and Exodus, when the people who were slaves in Egypt are now let out, and they end up in the desert. They end up with, they cross the Red Sea, they have the 10 Commandments, all of that. They wander through the desert for 40 years. We'll hear all about that. That's kind of neat. Not perfect, but it's neat. And then they eventually get into the green section, which is the conquest of the Promised Land. So they end up in the Promised Land, but they have to conquer it. So that's why the conquest. And then once they get there, things get a little imperfect, and they go through this cycle of sort of falling and coming back up, and falling and coming back up. And each time it comes back up through the help of what's called a judge. A judge isn't like somebody who issues orders and says guilty, not guilty. A judge, in the sense of the Bible, in this sense, is like a warrior king, somebody who's there for the nation when it needs somebody to lead it. So that's what judges are, through that section. And then after that, we'll go into the section where there's the royal kingdom, King David, King Solomon, etc., where the people, this is bad for them, they didn't want to be ruled by God. They didn't want to just follow God. They wanted a human king like all the other nations. Wrong on their part. But it worked for a little while. They had the royal kingdom, which was great. And then, because it was human-based and not God-based, it split. And we end up with the divided kingdom. So half of the people are in the south and half of the people in the north. Actually, it's 2 tribes in the south and 10 tribes in the north. But eventually, because they're now splintered, and there's sometimes good kings, but mostly bad kings, eventually the northern tribes get conquered, and they end up in exile. And then a little bit later, the southern half also gets conquered, and in 3 different waves they get force marched up to Babylon in exile, and they spend some time up there. Through a miraculous series of events, they end up getting a chance to return, which is this orange section here. They're let out of exile, they're let out of bondage, they're able to come back and rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, rebuild their society, rebuild their faith. And then the Romans come in, and one of the things they do is the Romans don't respect the sacredness of the temple. They go in, they desecrate the temple, and they have to fight to get the temple back. That's the Maccabean revolt section. And then this little sliver here is the Gospels. This is where Christ comes in. You go, wow, isn't he like the central figure? Shouldn't he have a bigger? Well, he was only around for 33 years, and he only taught for 3 years out of these thousands of years. So he gets a little sliver, but it's really important. We'll spend a whole night on just that. And then the last section is the church. This is after Christ ascends and the early parts of the church. So we'll get into that. So that's the overall walkthrough of the whole story of salvation in 3 or 4 minutes. You can look at it more detailed if you want to over there, and we'll go on. So let me back to that. So just a couple of comments before we dig into the content. First of all, I love Bible study. I mean, I love Bible study. It's how I came to faith. About 14 years ago, I started attending Bible study as a non-believer with my wife, who's a cradle Catholic, and over the course of a year, I came to faith. And so I'm really indebted to the Bible timeline, and I'm indebted to all sorts of things. But I love Bible study. It's how I learned who God was as opposed to what God was. If you understand the difference there, I'm a math and science guy, so I like to think out what is God. It's like, no, who is God? And we learn this. We start learning this right in the first pages. So what's the goal of this series? The goal is a broad overview of the Bible from creation all the way to the early church. And we'll take a deep dive into certain sections that are really, really important, but we will be doing a fast pace through the rest of it, just sort of going, in a plane, overlooking, going, look, and we'll just keep going real quick. At the end, I hope that you're acquainted with the story arc of salvation. And it's funny, when I typed that note in there, I realized that story arc, you think about a story arc, right? So it starts low, gets high, and goes low again. And that's just the opposite of what salvation history does. We start high in the Garden of Eden where everything's perfect. And then we drop down and we get messed up for a while, and then we end up with Jesus. So it's not really a story arc, it's sort of like a story smile, is really what we're going to be studying here, okay? If we think about the emotional impact of where we're going with this. And if you end up wanting to dive deeper, at the end of the course, I'll share some resources that you can study this even deeper with things. I've already mentioned Jeff Caven's The Great Adventure series. We'll also talk about some other stuff, but that's an incredibly great resource. Okay, let's ready to dive in. So, in the early world, right, starting with the first page of the Bible, we're going to start at the very beginning of the Bible, and we're going to cover Genesis chapters 1 through 11 tonight. That's the early world. And our deep dive is going to be on Genesis 1, 2, and 3, like I've already mentioned. Father John Ricardo says we get this right, everything's good. If we get this wrong, none of the rest of it makes sense. So this is really important. And you know the story of the first 3 chapters of the Bible, okay? Even if you haven't studied the Bible before, you know them. Chapter 1 is God creates the world in 6 days and then rests on the 7th. He creates everything, right? Chapter 2 is Adam and Eve, creation of Adam and Eve. And then chapter 3 is somebody eats an apple and everybody gets upset. Those are the first 3 chapters. And we're going to spend a lot of time just on those. The fall of Adam and Eve is where we get what's called original sin. And original sin is something that Adam and Eve did and we get stuck with, which doesn't seem fair. And it doesn't seem like, why is that? Why do we get stuck with something that they did so long ago? But we'll answer that soon. It's not appropriate to answer now, but we will be answering it soon in tonight's session. Part of our confusion about understanding that is the fact that many people don't really understand what sin is. A lot of people think that there's some man-made list of things called sins, and if we do something on that list, then somebody in authority has the right to shame us because we did something bad. That's not what a sin is. That's not what a sin is. And it's incredibly important to get it right because what we believe translates into how we live. And God wants us to live in accord with how he wants us to live, which is the best possible life. So we need to understand this properly. Now, by the way, if you've been to earlier talks of mine where I talk about Genesis 1, 2, and 3, it's okay. It'll be extremely helpful to hear it again as a refresher as we launch into the rest of the Bible. Plus, I'm going to add some new stuff in, so we'll get there. So, what happens in these first 3 chapters is critical to understanding the rest of our time together. Because in one way or another, the entire rest of the Bible is dedicated to fixing what happens in chapter 3. If we understand what happens in chapter 3, we understand what God is planning for the whole rest of the time. Anyway, the first 11 chapters of Genesis are what's called inspired poetry. Inspired poetry. Inspired comes from the Spirit. Inspired, Spirit, get it? Inspired, Spirit comes from the Spirit. So it's inspired in that a human author wrote it, but it was written with the instructions of the Holy Spirit. So both a human and divine author were involved in this. And it's inspired poetry because, sometimes you need to go into poetry in order to express things properly. For instance, if I said, and it's in my notes, but it's also true. So it's in my notes, so it's planned, but this is also true. You're all out here on a Wednesday night. It warms my heart that you're out here on a Wednesday night, that you want to study the Bible. It warms my heart. Now, did I just convey to you a truth about how I feel? Yeah. Is it literal? Does anybody believe that my heart literally got warmer? No. But you understand what I'm saying. But I'm speaking in the poetic, in a poetic way to convey a deep and profound truth. So the early parts of Genesis are that. It's inspired poetry. God's trying to teach us something that's larger than scientific and intellectual truths. So he has to go into the realm of poetry to be able to convey it, because he's not trying to convey like how the stars were made. He's telling us why everything was created. And that's really important. I'm a math and science guy, and I love understanding how things work. But I love understanding how things work. But God wants to teach us why things work the way they work. And science can't teach us that because science doesn't know the answers to that. Science didn't create the world. God created the world with a plan. So he reveals that to us. the science has limits. There's no telescope that can see God. We can't put God under a microscope and analyze it. We have to rely on God revealing himself to us in order to be able to understand why the world works the way it does. Why is that? And he reveals that to us here in the beginning of Genesis. So to understand one of the things, I like to back away from Genesis for a second, because we sort of take it for granted because we know a lot of the stories in Genesis. We'll be going through them, the first parts tonight, but we sort of know the stories. But sometimes we take Genesis for granted. To understand how unbelievable Genesis is, I want to step away for a moment and look at the world as it was in the ancient Near East. We're going to compare origin stories, because Genesis is an origin story, how the world was created. But there were other origin stories around in the world, because everybody sort of wants to know, how did everything come to be? In Genesis, God tapped on somebody's shoulder and actually told them, so they know what it is. But there were other origin stories. And are there any college professors in the room? Good. College professors. If there are and you're not willing to raise your hand, that's fine. Some college professors will say, well, all the creation stories are just alike. I mean, for instance, they all have a flood in the creation story, so they're all just copying off of each other. Well, that doesn't prove anything. If there really was a flood, all of the origin stories would somehow deal with the flood. So it doesn't make sense to say, well, there's some similarities, because sometimes history did happen and people wanted to figure this out. But only in Genesis do we find out why these things took place. So anyway, in the ancient Near East, the origin stories have certain things in common, which will contrast to Genesis. First of all, in the ancient Near East, there were many so-called gods. So-called because they're false gods, and lowercase g because they're not God, they're lowercase g. But they're called gods, so I call them gods. But they're lowercase. Anyway, so there's always many so-called gods, and they're all bad and violent and beating up on each other. And sometimes they're not just bad and violent, they're downright cruel. The creation of the world itself comes from violence or sex. Somebody rips somebody's arm off and twists it into a ball, and there's a mountain, and the rest of the torso, there's the earth. I mean, it's just terrible. It's just sex and violence all over the place. None of them had ultimate power, because they were all fighting with each other and trying to get ahead, heads up on all that kind of stuff. It was just a massive chaos. And the most important thing when it comes to how we look at it is the men had only one rule, or one role in life, and that was to be slaves to the gods. They were to serve the gods. And women also only had one role in life, and that was to bear children. That was it. Really down on the totem pole there. So as it relates to us, men are slaves, women bear children, and that's it. That was the mindset of the ancient Near East. Now, in that mindset, okay, men had all the power, women had no power, and in walks Genesis, which is different. In Genesis, we see that there is only one God. He is good, all good. There's no bad, there's no violence, there's no conflict, there's no nothing. He's just all good. And he creates out of love, not necessity, and he creates effortlessly. We hear him speaking things into existence. Really easy. There's no violence and twisting things up, and it's just, there it is. There it is. We have a real hard time understanding infinite power. A real hard time, because infinite is really just hard to wrap your heads around. The best mathematicians in the world have literally gone insane trying to understand infinity. So understanding God's unbelievable infinite power is hard for us, but he can speak the entire world into existence with no effort, all out of love. And the most important thing when it relates to us is man and woman are the pinnacle of creation. Everything leads up to the fact that we're here. It's fantastic. And they're equals, which we'll get into in a second, which is completely different than the ancient Near East. The fact that Genesis took hold and became the new understanding of how things worked, and that men and women were equal, is absolutely amazing. In my opinion, the only way it could have possibly taken root is the fact that it was given to us by God, because otherwise the men would not have given up power. Anyway, so let me go through a quick summary of Genesis 1, a quick summary of Genesis 2, and then we're going to spend a little bit more time in Genesis 3. But we'll set up and go through this. First of all, in Genesis 1, God creates the world in 6 days. I'm a math and science guy. Right there, when I read that, I go, no way. There's no way. I know how long it takes for gases to swirl around and create enough gravitational force to create a nuclear furnace to create a star. There's no way that happens in 6 days. And it all happens, on one day. There's no way. But I didn't understand how it is. The word day in Hebrew is yom. And yom means period of time. It's very often used as day, because that is a defined period of time, whether it's sunset to sunset or noon to noon or midnight to midnight, however you want to do it, but that's a defined period of time. But so is the Stone Age. So is your lifetime. Those are all yoms. They're all periods of time. So when it says the world is created in 6 days, yeah, there was a period for this, there was a period for this, there was a period for this. And I go, okay, that makes sense. I can sort of back away from my math and science and say, okay, that kind of makes sense. What we learn also in Genesis 1 is he creates effortlessly and without rivals. I've already mentioned that. And everything he creates is good. Everything he creates is good. This is amazing because Genesis chapter 1 is all on one page, unless you've got a Bible that has a whole bunch of footnotes, in which case it might be 2 pages. But you know what? If there's no footnotes, all of this happens on one page. He creates the entire world, populates it, and then ends up with us all in one page. The story of creation is in one page. So there's very few words on a single page to describe all of that. And he creates something on a day, and then at the end of the day he says, and it was good. Then he creates something else on the next day, and it was good. And he creates another thing, and it was good. He uses up a lot of ink, a lot of words on making sure that we understand that everything he creates is good. He's all good, and everything he creates is good. This is really important to know. And so he goes through this. And as he does this, God creates the sun, the moon, the stars, the oceans, the beasts, the mountains, all these different kinds of things. And what I found fascinating when I first started studying this, I can't remember who I heard it from, that the things that he talks about that he's creating, like sun, moon, stars, and all kinds of stuff, those are things that ancient civilizations were worshiping. So God is, by revealing to us that, no, I created those. Stop worshiping the created things, start worshiping the creator. There's a big difference between that. So it's a little very subtle thing. So he doesn't come out and say it like that, but he just explains in there that, hey, I created the sun, the moon, the stars, all these things that you're worshiping. You're misdirected, which is kind of neat. And then in Genesis chapter 1, verse 16, I think this is in day 4, I'm not sure. He talks about creating the great light for the day and the lesser light for the night, right? The sun and the moon. And then finishes that verse by saying, he created the stars too. He created the stars too. You know how big a star is? 1 star? And then in our own galaxy, they tell us there's like 100 billion stars in our galaxy. And then outside of our galaxies are like 100 to 200 billion galaxies, each with 100 billion stars. I don't know, you do the math on that. I'm a math guy, but you do the math on that. There's a lot of stars, and each one is enormous. And it ranks 5 words in the Bible. That's how infinite power. It's just 5 words. I'm going to tell you about it, but it's no big deal. Don't talk to me about it. It's just stars. Okay, boom, it's done. God is amazingly powerful. The grandeur and the power is just unbelievably imaginable. Unbelievably unimaginable, whatever. Grammatically I'm a little messed up. Anyway, and then as it relates to us, the most important thing is at the end of chapter 1, we find out that the pinnacle of creation is you. God created all of that, put all of that in place, made an intelligible universe that we can see, all so that you can be sitting here on a Wednesday night, all so that you can live your life the way you want to. That's what he did it all for. Everything points to that. We're not a footnote. We were the end goal of all of this, which is really neat to know. Quick summary of Genesis 2. This is where we get into Adam and Eve. So on Genesis 1, we hear the story of creation from a wide-angle lens, all of creation. Genesis 2 is a separate creation story, but a narrow lens, because now we're just focusing on the origin of humanity, so Adam and Eve. And so God creates Adam and Eve. He creates Adam first, right? And we hear for the first time in the Bible that something isn't good, right? First page, now we're on the second page. First page was, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's very good. Genesis chapter 2, we first hear that something's not good. It's not good for man to be alone. So he creates Eve. And we know how it happens. Adam goes to sleep, takes the rib, and the rib is something that guards the heart. So Eve, it comes from what guards the heart, which is wonderfully poetic. And Adam can actually recognize who he is by seeing the woman, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, right? It's wonderful. So, and we find out through this that man and woman are created equal in dignity. We find this out through a neat line that a lot of people misinterpret. And it says this: I will make a helper for him. And people go, oh, helper, some subservient, housemaid or something. No. The word in Hebrew, and this is, Yom I got messed up, Ezer I got messed up too. The word in Hebrew for helper is Ezer. And Ezer is used 19 times in the Old Testament. Only 2 times does it relate to Eve. The other 17 times it's used in the Old Testament, Ezer refers to God and the help that God gives the people. So Ezer is not some subservient housemaid. It's divine help. This is the idea that man and woman emulate the Trinity and the relations between them. But we won't get there because we're way ahead of ourselves there. We find out that God makes us in his image. What does that mean? Well, we're in his image in that we have certain traits that God has. We have rationality, we have free will, we have these kinds of things. So we're made in his image. He's given us traits that he himself has. And then we find out that our purpose, the purpose for which we were created, is the end goal that he wants for us is for us to be with him in heaven. We find out these are in the letters later on in the Bible, but we find out we are made to share in the divine nature. That's what we're made for. So that's the whole goal. We're skipping all the way into the Bible to know what our end goal is, but sometimes that helps to be able to inform us. Now, the big question comes in here as we move into Genesis 3 here. So the big question is, if everything that God created is good, why do things go wrong in the Garden of Eden? Why do things go wrong in the garden? Everything we created was good. So how does anything go wrong? Well, as wonderful as science is, it can't answer this question because it's a why question. Why did things go wrong? And science can't answer those questions. Only God can answer those questions. So let's try and answer this why question by first answering a what question. What was unique about the fact that God created man and woman? What is unique about man and woman that is different than all of creation? The mountain, the rocks, the grass, the dog, the panda, all the rest of the things. What is different about us than all the rest of creation? Free will. Free will, exactly. It's one of the things that he gave us because we're made in his image. So free will is what's different. Now, it's an incredible gift, and it's an example of how much God loves us. But we need to understand that free will, freedom, is not intended to be the capacity to do whatever we want, because that's just chaos. If you want proof of that, on the way home tonight, use your free will to drive on the wrong side of the road. That's free will. You got the free will, right? Everything should be fine with free. No. God gave us the right to choose, but that doesn't mean that every choice is right. We need to use our free will properly in order to live a good life. So the primary purpose of freedom, the reason God gave us free will, the primary purpose was so that we could love. Because love is everything. God is love. We hear that later in the Bible as well. Love is how we get to heaven. Love are the 2 great commandments, right? Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? Everything goes to love. So our free will had to come in order to be able to love, because you can't love without free will. Imagine the people that you love. Imagine how they love you. Imagine how you love them. And now imagine there's no free will involved. You just have to. It's just part of the package. Is it love anymore? It's something different. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's not love. And so he gave us that so that we could do that. Now we also need free will to do other things. We need free will to be able to forgive properly, to have faith, to form relationships, to pursue ambitions, to go after a career. And because we have free will, we have moral responsibility. Some people like to think that they don't have moral responsibility, but God gave us free will, so we've got moral responsibility. And only humans and angels have free will. All the rest of creation doesn't have free will. So only humans and angels have free will. And as such, only humans and angels can be disobedient to God. And you go, aha, I know what happened. I know what happened, right? We used our free will in the wrong way. God got upset. Now we're all being punished. That's not what happened. That's not what happened. Now, some people view the fall this way. Father John Ricardo says this, and I think it's an interesting way to lead into it. He says, some people view the fall this way. God planted a tree in the middle of the garden for no particular purpose. He then told them, you can eat of any other tree, but you can't eat of that tree. And he told them that for no particular purpose. And then when they did that, he got angry and kicked them out of paradise. That's not the right way to view Genesis chapter 3, because that's not what's happening. First of all, in Genesis chapter 3, what's the name of that tree? Anybody know? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Some of you might have said the tree of life. Those are the only two trees that we know the name of. Okay, there's other trees around, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is one of the trees. All of these trees represent the traits that God has, the traits that God wants to share with us, the traits that he gave us when we're made in his image. But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a different tree. I'm getting ahead of myself. So wait. That apple, it's not an apple tree. Okay, we hear, I got ahead of myself. I'm backing up for just a second. It's not an apple, and it's not an arbitrary rule. It's not an apple because it's the fruit of the knowledge of good. Wait, hold on. It's the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is a mouthful. Which is why you can understand why it sort of got replaced by apple. So, but when we talk about the apple, just know that it's the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay, apple. And it's not an arbitrary rule. God didn't just say, oh, I'm picking that one to make for you not to do it. There's a reason why, okay? Now, back to what I was saying, because I got ahead of myself. All these trees are there for a reason. They all represent different traits of God. We don't hear the names of all of them, but that's what it is. And the two trees that we do know the names of, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we know about those. And he says, you can't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He wants to share everything with us. And he says, you can't eat of that because on the day you eat of that tree, you will surely die. Whoa, wait a second. I thought God was all loving. Where is this coming from? This is really, this is a big threat, right? On the day you eat of that tree, you shall surely die. And why is that? What does that mean? To eat of the tree means to try and make that your own, to make that trait your own. And basically what Adam and Eve do by trying to take of that tree, especially when they're warned not to, is they're trying to make the claim that they have the power to decide whether something's good or evil. That God doesn't have that power, that they have that power also. But they can't, because they're not creators, right? He wants to share everything with us, so all the trees are there. We can see them all, but don't do that one because you can't do that. You're not creators. You don't have that power. You don't have the power to decide whether or not something's good or evil. I created the world. I know what's good for you. I know what's bad for you. I'll tell you, just trust me, you can't do that one. It's not like he's saying, man, you can't do that. He's saying, man, you can't do that. Trust me. If you touch that one, if you eat of that tree, you'll surely die. And if we do, we try and make ourselves into gods, which doesn't make sense. And if you think about this kind of visually, I'm a visual kind of person. If you imagine, and we're going to talk about Eve because Eve's the first one that did it. Eve goes to reach for the apple or fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She goes to reach for that. She knows that God has said, you can't do that. So as she's reaching for something that she knows that God has said no to, she's got to be pushing God away with the other hand, basically, right? So she's reaching in this direction. She's pushing away the author of life. What happens when you push away life? You die. So God has said in shorthand, on the day you eat of that, because I've told you not to, on the day you eat of that, you will surely die. And you'll surely die because you've done it to yourself, basically. Because it's have I skipped over things? Only God can label things good and evil. If we try, we cut ourselves off from God. See, I'm not clicking on this thing. I start going and I forget to do this. So when he says, on the day you eat of that, you shall surely die, he means it. But it was a shorthand. And it's not a punishment, but it's a consequence. It's a consequence of the fact that we do this. We don't listen to God. We don't trust God. We just push him away. So he's told us, and we push him away. I'll give you an example. Imagine you go home tonight after you've driven on the wrong side of the road and somehow you made it home. You go home tonight and you decide, well, it's early enough. I'm going to make myself a snack. So you turn on the stove and, up comes either flames or a red hot burner thing. Either way, it's really nice, pretty red, right? And you go, oh, I want to touch that because it's all nice and pretty. And you go and you stop yourself because it's going to hurt. So you don't do that, okay? But imagine if there's a toddler in the house. And the toddler comes running in because you haven't put a pot on it yet. And the toddler runs in and says the nice, pretty red glow. And the toddler doesn't know, so the toddler goes to reach for it. What do? No! Stop! Don't do that. You'll hurt yourself. Now, do you take the time to explain to the toddler that, if you do that, first of all, there's heat, and then, that's a certain temperature, and that at a certain temperature, your skin, you don't do that. You just say, stop, trust me, don't do that. That's what God is saying. Stop, don't eat of that tree. On the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. Not as a punishment. He doesn't punish us to do that. That's consequences of what we do. God is asking, will you trust me? That line is going to follow us all throughout the Bible. The whole arc of salvation history is God saying, will you trust me? I created everything. I know what's good for you. I know what's bad for you. Will you trust me? And do it. And we keep saying, nah, we'll figure it out. Anyway, so everything that I just mentioned is accurate, but I left out one very important part. I left out one very important character in Genesis chapter 3. What's the character I left out? The snake, the serpent, Satan, all that stuff. I don't like using his name, so I just call him the enemy. And because I just, like to leave it that way. And it's really important to understand the enemy. So who is the enemy? Well, the enemy started out as an angel, but rebelled because the enemy had free will. So at some point in time, or even before time was created, I'm not quite sure, God reveals to the angels his plan. He wants to create us. We're the pinnacle of creation, and he wants us to live with him in heaven. And one of the angels, the enemy, says, I don't like that idea. And used his free will to say, I won't serve. Non serviam. I won't serve. And he fell. That's our enemy. And he took some with him. Those are the demons. That's not good. But let me point out one thing real quick. We say God, enemy's powerful, but no match for God. It's not like there's a good God and there's a bad God. They're duking it out. We don't know who's going to win. That's not what it is. There's God and there's a creature that doesn't like us. Okay. God can get rid of this creature anytime he wants to. There's a reason he still exists, but that's another story. So there's no duking it out. We don't have to worry. God wins. That's the end. Skip right to the end of the story. God wins. Okay. So there's no problem there. There's no God. There's only one God. There's no equals. Now, why did the enemy rebel? This one is absolutely critical. You want to understand everything, about the enemy, you understand why he rebelled. We find out about halfway through the Bible, we're skipping ahead again to understand what's going on. We skip ahead to the book of Wisdom, chapter 2, verse 24, and it says, through the devil's envy, death entered the world. And a lot of people think, well, envy is kind of like jealousy, so I can interchange those words. Those are two very, very different words. And I contrast them to let you know what envy means. Jealousy is liking something that somebody else has. Right? So Lisa, if you happen to play the piano very well, and I hear you playing, I go, oh, that's beautiful. I wish I had that. I'm jealous of that skill. Well, that might spur me on to learn myself, right? So that would be a good thing to be jealous of that talent. But I might say, Fred, I'm jealous of that car, and I go key your car. That would be bad. I'm not going to do that. You don't have to worry about it. So, but that would be a bad outcome of jealousy. But envy only has negative outcomes. Because envy is slightly different than jealousy. Envy says, I want what you have, and I don't like the fact that you have it. Envy wants to remove what you have that is good because it upsets the person that has the envy. So through the devil's envy of us, death entered the world. So he's envious of us, not God, and he goes to war against us, not God. Because if he goes up against God, God's going to destroy him. But he goes up against us, and so we got to be careful of this. What's the enemy's strategy? Well, the enemy lies. The enemy lied in the garden. He lies to us today, and it's the same lies over and over again. You can't trust God. He's not on your side. He's restricting you from doing this, so he doesn't really love you. All this kind of stuff. It worked back then. It works now. It's the same thing. What's the enemy's end goal? We find this out way at the end in the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 10, when we hear the thief, the enemy. The thief comes to steal, to kill, and to destroy. To steal you away from God, to kill you and to destroy you. That's what the enemy does. It gets a little dark when you think about what the enemy wants to do. But if we understand the enemy and we have an enemy, then we can be guarded against it. We stay close to God and everything's fine. So, ultimately, the enemy's goal is to get us to sin by lying to us, getting back to sin. Now, as we study the Bible, you're going to find out that there are certain words, certain concepts, but specifically certain words that in one context mean something, and then in another context it means something else, in another context it means something else. They're all kind of related, but you got to understand where it goes. Sin is one of those words. We can think of sins as actions, right? Things that we do or do not do, right? Stealing a pack of gum, murdering somebody, very opposite ends of the spectrum here, but those are things that we do. These are sins that are actions. There's also, you can think of sin as something that separates us from God. The origin of the word sin itself means separation. So that's something that separates us from God. Stealing a pack of gum separates us a little bit. He doesn't like it, but yeah, we're okay. Murdering somebody, that's another whole story. Then you got to repair that relationship. So different sins will separate us from God in different things. Another way to look at sin is, and this is important also, is sin is a power. Sin is an enemy, okay? So it's capital S, sin. It is an entity that, and we can be captured by that power. And if we're captured by something, we become slaves to that power. We become slaves to that enemy. We become slaves to sin. In the letter of the Romans, St. Paul tells us that we are enslaved to sin. I don't know if you've ever heard the term that we're inclined to sin. It's not that, it's worse than that. We're enslaved to sin. All of us have something that we struggle against. We're enslaved by that sin. And also in Romans, he says that all men are under the power of sin. Not that we're attracted by it or that, but we're under the power of sin. So, Father John Ricardo asked this question, which I think is a good demonstration of what's going on here. Think about this. Have you ever done something, think back through your life, have you ever done something that you knew you shouldn't do? You didn't want to do it. You hated the fact that you were about to do it, and you did it anyway. Anyone? That's the power of sin. Where'd your free will go? You didn't want to do it, you knew it was wrong, and you hated the fact that you're about to do it, and you still did it. That's the power of sin. You just have no control. Being enslaved to sin is more than just being addicted to something. It's being powerless to resist it. That's what sin does in its large sense. We're not talking about stealing a pack of gum here. We're talking about larger ones, right? So in Romans chapter 7, St. Paul says this is unbelievable. He says, "For I do not do the good I want, but the evil that I do not want is what I do." And that's St. Paul. That's St. Paul. It's a good description. It's a great description of being captured by sin, is that line there. Now, I'll give you an analogy. Is anybody here from Canada? Good. Okay. So there were no college professors, so nobody from Canada. I'll use this analogy. Imagine that you've been told by people, people trustworthy, you shouldn't go to Canada. It's really bad. You don't want to go there. You shouldn't go there. You shouldn't go there. I'm just using it as a hypothetical. Okay. You shouldn't go to Canada. Don't go to Canada. Things bad happen. But you're up in Buffalo, New York. It's right across the thing. Hey, let's go to Canada. Your friends say, hey, let's go to Canada for the afternoon. Let's go. And as soon as you cross the border, bam, they grab you. They take your passport. They do not let you back. They do not let you home. And now you're stuck in evil Canada. Okay. That's what sin does. It grabs you and it takes your passport and you can't come back, which is really bad. Now, I could skip ahead and say how Jesus saves us, but we're not there yet, okay? But sin's bad. So Adam and Eve's original sin, right, getting back to original sin, Adam and Eve's original sin was an action, it separated them from God, and it was a power that captured them. And as such, they pass along original sin to us. Because, I'll ask you a question, if a child is born to slaves, is the child born free or a slave? Slave. So it passes down through the generations, right? There's another way to look at it. I'm a math and science guy. There are times when, we can have a mutation in our DNA, so it affects us, in some way. We've got a mutation. Well, we're going to pass that down to our kids, right? So, in a sense, Adam and Eve broke or mutated our spiritual DNA. with original sin. And then that just gets passed down to us. Luckily, baptism takes care of it, but again, I'm skipping ahead, so we won't do that. There are fixes for this, but we need to understand what's going on and what everybody in the Old Testament will be dealing with as we go through this. So we can also, by the way, do this damage to ourselves. Right? Adam and Eve did original sin. We go, we didn't like that, but we can get rid of that through baptism. But we can also do sins ourselves. This is what's called actual sin, as opposed to original sin. We have the same problem. Okay, but we can't blame them. We can only blame ourselves. Now, so sins are actions. They separate us from God to some extent. And sin's a power. But it's important, it's really, really important to understand that sins aren't just a set of rules. Going back to what I said earlier. Sins are things that are spiritually bad for us. So it's not just a set of rules, it's things that are spiritually bad for us. And God knows that, and he warns us about that out of love. God created everything. He created the physical world, which we understand very well, but he also has created the spiritual world, which we don't understand very well. And so God, as a good father, warns us about that out of love for us. It's up to us whether or not we trust God, okay? Or we think we can figure it out on our own. I know how to build this, but I don't know how to do things spiritually nearly as well. So he warns us out of love, and so in a sense, and this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, humor time, he gives us a spiritual injury notice, S-I-N. I came up with that. I've looked on the internet. Nobody else uses that. I think I came up with it on my own. I think it's kind of cool. Now we'll move on with the rest of the talk. Okay, so it's important to understand that avoiding sin isn't following the rules. Avoiding sin is trusting that our loving Father is telling us the truth about things that will hurt us. That's important. That's important to understand. At this point, by the way, if you're sitting here and you still think that sins are basically just a list of rules that somebody came up with, that if we do something, somebody has the right to shame us, the reason you still believe that is because the enemy has done a really good job of convincing you that that's true, but that's not the truth. Okay? We don't want to be deceived by the enemy, so we want to extract that out and look at it properly. If the enemy can deceive you and convince you to sin, then he wins. He can't go up against God and break up the party in heaven that God intends for us. But he can get us to separate ourselves voluntarily from God by sin. So the enemy didn't need to beat God, and he can't. But he can beat us if we're not smart and we don't understand what's going on. He's accomplished his objective, which is to separate us from God. Now, I happen to think that it's really important. That's why I've spent so much time on it, because it's an important topic to me. I happen to think it's really important to internalize sin as that which is bad for you. But it's still disobedience to God. It is absolutely still disobedience to God. Think about this. When you're a small child and your father tells you to not go play in the street, why is he doing that? Because it's dangerous out there. So he's warning you. But if you go and do that, you're putting yourself in harm's way, but you're also being disobedient to your loving Father. So it's both, okay? Sin has the quality of being both harmful and disobedient at the same time. But if you only think of it in terms of disobedience, then you can think of God as a tyrant, and that's not true. You got to think of him as a loving Father who wants the best for you. And then when we go play in the street, metaphorically, then we've disobeyed our Father. And we've also put ourselves in harm's way. But the reason he told us not to do it is because it's dangerous out there. Sorry, I'm getting on a soapbox. Okay. That's close to the end of chapter 3. At the end of chapter 3, at this point, Adam and Eve, who have now just sort of broken everything, they go and run and hide from God. Why? For the same reason that most of us run and hide from God when we've done something wrong. It's embarrassing. We don't want to. We just say, he didn't look. He wasn't watching. He didn't see. Yeah, okay. But they also run and hide from each other. Or not hide from each other, but they're sort of cautious of each other. Earlier in chapter 2, it says they were naked and unashamed. Now they're covering themselves up. Why? Because they've unleashed evil. They've unleashed this distrust. So now, man and woman, in the sense of Adam and Eve, they're now not trusting each other quite as well. Because now they've opened up, instead of just pure love where everybody wants the best for everybody, now they're wondering, could they possibly be doing something that's wrong? It's really weird. So we see this right away. God exiles them from the garden, and it's not as a punishment. It's for their own good, because he doesn't want them in this spiritually sick state to eat of the tree of the knowledge. They've already eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He doesn't want them to eat of the tree of life and then live forever sick. He wants to heal them first. He wants to heal humanity first. This is what's going to be happening throughout the rest of our time together. He wants to heal humanity first. And this takes a while, okay? Also, God, in verse 15, he proclaims starting in verse 15, he proclaims what's called the proto-evangelium, basically the earliest seeds of the Bible, of the gospel, of the fact that there's a Messiah coming. He says that the seed of the woman, one of her descendants, will crush the enemy. We hear that right here in the third page of the Bible. It's a hint. Doesn't expand on it till much later, but it's a hint. Now, if this were a standalone talk, I'd skip forward to the New Testament. We'd talk about how Jesus saves us from all this, and we'd move on, and we all end up happy. But that would be moving ahead way too quick. We got to stick with Genesis. But luckily now, because we know how devastating sin is, we can understand how important it is to be saved. And it's important how important it is to be saved, and we also know this to understand the rest of the Bible very well. But we don't get to Jesus for a few weeks yet. So, as we move on to Genesis chapters 4 through 11, we've gone through the deep dive, okay, which took a lot of time. Chapters 4 through 11, I'm going to go skim through really, really fast. We're almost done. So, in chapter 4, we hear the story of Cain and Abel. And summarizing, Cain kills Abel. Boom, but that's it. But what's that? Really, I told you we're going to go quick. No, it starts out, Cain and Abel are offering sacrifice to God. Now, when offering sacrifice to God is a theme that we will hear over and over and over again. This is just the first hint of it. Offering sacrifice to God. It's one of the central themes of the Bible. And sacrifice, one of the things that happens here is you show respect to the person that you're offering sacrifice to. But you're also trying to get closer to that person, okay? Getting closer to God. That's the opposite direction of sin, right? So you're trying to repair that through sacrifice. And think about when you sacrifice your time for someone. What's the effect? You get closer. So that's what happens. God rejects Cain's sacrifice, and if you read into it, you find out that Cain was not giving with the correct heart. So he's saying, hey, no, get yourself right and I'll accept your sacrifice. What does Cain do? He gets upset. Because sin begets sin, Cain ends up killing Abel out of jealousy or envy or whatever you want to call it. And we find the first murder takes place in the second generation. Sin has a way of multiplying really, really fast. So now, to shift gears here for a second, that was the little bit expanded story of Cain and Abel, a little bit faster than Cain kills Abel. Okay, to shift gears here for a second, we're going to look at something called the Toledot, which occurs in Genesis chapter 5. And Toledot is like a family tree, but upside down. When we think of family trees, we generally think of, here's my parents, here's my grandparents, here's my great-grandparents, etc., right? We're looking up into ancestors. But in the Toledot, we're looking down, we're looking at descendants. And this is the part of the Bible, the part of the Genesis that most people just sort of skip over, because there's like a whole bunch of names that we can't understand, we can't pronounce pretty well, we just sort of skip past them. We go, well, who cares? And let's move back to the story. But the Toledot really, it's a literary technique that allows us to follow the story properly. Because if you think about it, if so-and-so has a few kids, and they each have a few kids, and they each have a few kids, and by the time you get a few generations down, where's the story? Who am I supposed to be following? Where's the story that leads to Christ? Where's the story that leads to salvation? You've got no idea. The Toledot tells you, follow this way, and that's where you continue the story. So if we look at the Toledot, we start with Adam, and Adam has at least 3 children, Cain and Abel, which are the grayed out ones, because we're not going to follow them. The line of promise goes through Seth. We find out that Adam and Eve had another son named Seth, and that's where the line of promise goes. So the Toledot tells us to follow Seth. It doesn't even mention Cain and Abel, okay? In these Toledots, you don't even really hear about the rest of the kids. You just hear, and they had other kids, but follow this guy. Seth has Enosh and others, but we follow Enosh. And then Enosh has, and there's several generations. I don't have enough room on the screen to put them all. There's like 11 generations that go through here, and I don't have room. So there's a bunch of them, and then somebody has Methuselah. We all know Methuselah because why? He's the oldest guy in the Bible, right? We'll talk about that in a sec. So we get to Methuselah, and he has a bunch of kids, one of which is named Lamech. And Lamech has Noah. We're back to the story that we know. The reason we know the story of Noah is because the Toledot told us to follow Noah. Okay, and then Noah has 3 kids, and all of them are essential to the story, so we know all of their names: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ultimately, we'll be following the line of Shem down, but at the point in the story that we need to know about them, we know all three of them, whereas the rest of them were just sort of follow, follow, follow. Now back to Methuselah for a second. We hear in this first Toledot the incredible lengthy lives that these people are having, right? 500 years old, 700 years old. How old is Methuselah? Anybody know? 969 years old. And you go, that's crazy. This is where we get it backwards. When I heard this, it was like, whoa, this is kind of cool. This is where we get it backwards. We're not supposed to be looking and going, Methuselah was 969 years old. That's crazy. It's like, no, the answer is, he's dying? We weren't meant to die. We were meant to live forever. They messed it up in the garden. Through the envy of the devil, death entered the world. What we should be looking at this Toledot is not 500 years old, 700 years old, 900 years old. They're dying. Something's wrong. So it's backwards. There's all sorts of things that we get backwards as we go through it. I'll try and point out as many as I can think of. Anyway, so the Toledot doesn't include all the descendants, but focuses on how we drive the story forward. There are others. There are other people in the world. We just don't know about all the stories because we're following the one story. So it focuses on the line of promise, which goes through Seth. So Seth is the good line. Okay, Seth is the line that will lead to Christ ultimately. There are other lines that aren't key to the story, so we don't know about them. And then there's some bad lines that we know about. For instance, Cain. Okay, Cain goes off, and you hear about his descendants also, but that's a bad line. We're not following that line, but we know he exists. Okay, but that's the bad line. Now we turn our attention back. We go to Genesis chapter 6, and we hear a bit of a footnote, but I know everybody's interested in who are the Nephilim. Okay, we hear about this Nephilim. Are these the giants that used to? What is Nephilim? Well, the first clue comes from that Toledot. Okay, because in the Toledot, when Adam had Seth, it says that Adam and Eve had Seth in their image. Seth was created in their image. So if Seth was created in Adam's image, and Adam was created in God's image, then Seth is created in God's image. So Seth is one of the sons of God. We know that from the Toledot. When it describes Cain and his descendants, it has no such thing of the image. Something's broken there, so we don't hear that. So Seth is the good line, Cain's the bad line. And then in Genesis chapter 6, we read that the sons of God, Seth, and the daughters of man, the Cain line, are intermarrying. And when they do so, they create the Nephilim. And the Nephilim, the word in Hebrew that we get Nephilim from is Nephal, which means fallen. So these are the fallen people. So back then, if you intermarried with some where they're worshiping false gods or whatever else like that, you end up going in the wrong direction. It's really easy to do that. Okay, we have great things to lean on today, but I'm not going to get forward on the New Testament yet. They didn't have that back then. So the Nephilim are those that are fallen, and it says that the Nephilim are called the mighty men of old, the men of renown. And you hear that and you go, wow, that sounds really cool. That could be like the beginning of a Western, the mighty men of old, the men of renown. But that's only because we're putting a positive spin on it. You could also say the mighty men of old that terrorized a town, the men of renown that should be on a wanted poster. It could be negative as well. The mighty men who did terrible things and the men of renown. Everybody knew they did terrible things. And in fact, in the very next verse of the Bible, after that, it says that God saw that wickedness was great on the earth, and everyone was thinking of evil continually. Everything had just gone really, really bad. And this is where God wanted to start over. So, we get to Noah, and what's Noah famous for? The flood. Okay, so we get to the great flood. Rains 40 days, rain, boom, animals, ark. Okay, we all know the story of the flood. I'm not going to spend the time to go through that. You know the story of the flood. And sometimes we think it's just Noah, but it was actually Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their daughters. So there's 8 people that were on the ark. And the great flood. Yeah, okay. After the flood, God promises Noah, this is one of the covenants, but we're not going to get into covenant for right now, but it's one of the covenants. God promises that he'll never do this again. He's never going to start over in this way. He's never going to flood the earth again. So God makes that promise. And as a sign of his promise, he puts his bow in the clouds. And the bow isn't just a nice arc that's pretty, it's the weapon, bow and arrow. He's putting his weapon away, saying, I'm never going to do that again. I'm never going to start over like this again. Not going to do that. And he makes that solemn promise to us. So when we see the rainbow, realize that it's a sign from God. It's not a sign of man, it's a sign of God. A sign that comes from God. That's where the rainbow comes from. Now Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, they get blessed by God. So God blesses Noah's son and says, repopulate the earth, right? Just wiped everything away. Let's try and make this good. Because he found Noah, which was a righteous man, the family, let's repopulate the earth. So he blesses the sons. And then, sometime shortly after that, Noah gets drunk, falls asleep in his tent, and Ham does something unspeakable. We don't know exactly what it is. We hear the description of it. It says that Ham uncovered the nakedness of his father. Now that can mean one of 2 things. The scholars aren't exactly sure what it means. It could either mean that he had improper relations with his mother, Noah's wife, or he had improper relationships with Noah when he was drunk and out cold. We don't know which one it is, but either one is really bad. And the intent was to degrade Noah, to dominate over Noah. So Ham was trying to exert his dominance. So it's really bad. Noah wakes up and he's kind of upset, and he wants to curse something, but he can't curse Ham, his son, because God has already blessed him. So that wouldn't work. You curse something that God has blessed, that's not going to do anything. So what Noah does is curse Ham's son, Canaan. This is the Canaanites. This is the land of Canaan, where all sorts of debauchery took place. And it all took place, it starts with this curse that takes place. So we go from there to Noah's curse. We go from there to Genesis chapter 10. We're only 2 left. Genesis chapter 10, which is the table of nations. This is the Toledot on steroids, okay? This is the repopulation of the earth. So we hear about Ham's line, we hear about Shem's line, we hear about Japheth's line and where they populated. And if you look through it, you'll find names that we're familiar with. Some of the nations that grew out, like Egypt. We find who created Assyria or Babylon or whatever through this table of nations. I don't know how to pronounce the name. It's Javan, Javan. I don't know who created Greece. So all of this, we see all of this in the Table of Nations, how the world is repopulated. And then we get to Genesis chapter 11, the last chapter we're going to hit, and that's the Tower of Babel. And at this point, all of humanity has decided to unite. This is a very odd thing, because sin usually divides. But in this case, all of humanity united in defiance of God. And they wanted to storm heaven. They wanted to get to heaven. They didn't want God's help. They were going to build a tower to heaven. This is the Tower of Babel. And so they wanted to do this without help from God, without any assistance from God. That's pride. That's the primary sin that we all have, is to not trust God, not want God helping us. We're going to do it ourselves. And if you read what they say they want to make a name for themselves by doing this. They want to make a name for themselves. Now the Hebrew word for name is Shem. That's the line of promise that goes down through Noah. They wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted to be the line of promise. So they wanted to make a name for themselves, a Shem for themselves, in utter defiance of what's going on. So God looks down and says, well, that's cute. That Lego pile probably won't reach me anytime soon. But he realizes there's a problem. And in order to slow them down, he confuses their language. So now they can't speak together very well, and everything sort of messes up. And that's where we get the word babble from. When you're babbling about something, they're confused language. And so at this point, as you can imagine, God wants to start again. But he won't be flooding the earth again because the rainbow's up there. He's promised not to do that again. So instead, he calls out to one man. Next week, and throughout the whole rest of the Bible, we're going to see this question, will you trust God? Will you trust God? And tonight, we saw that God creates humanity. God created Adam and Eve out of love, and then humanity falls and rebels. Then he started again with Noah and his family, and then they fell and rebelled again. Next week, God creates a new approach. He begins again with one righteous man who is going to trust God, and that's Abraham. That's who he's going to start again with. Abraham's descendants will be numerous. And God will form ever closer bonds through covenants. We'll get into covenants. And he will ask the people to trust him. He will patiently nurture and teach the people over a period of centuries, because ultimately God wants them to be ready to understand and accept his Son when he comes in the New Testament. Thanks for listening. God bless you. God bless our country, and God bless the church all throughout the world.